The story of Perkin Warbeck cannot be told without Margaret of Burgundy and Elizabeth of York. Without his alleged aunt's support, Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard of Shrewsbury, could never have posed a serious threat to the young Tudor dynasty under Henry VII. He also turned against the woman believed to be his eldest sister. That woman, Elizabeth of York, was Henry's wife. Supporters of Warbeck's claim often highlight the lack of recorded reaction from Elizabeth, suggesting she recognized him as her brother and that her response was deliberately suppressed. However, this assumption is incorrect. Within the limits of her position, Elizabeth actively opposed Warbeck's challenge to the crown. Welcome back to Lemmy History. In this three-part series, I explore the struggle between Elizabeth and Margaret for dominance over the House of York and, by extension, for England itself. Each episode is designed to be followed independently, but of course I'd love for you to watch all three. This is episode 3, the final installment of the series. Before we dive in, I have 3 quick notes. First, I previously made a detailed video about Warbeck's life, which is linked in the description. I won't be repeating the full details of his story here. Second, I firmly believe he was an imposter. A few weeks ago, I released a video explaining my reasoning based on historical sources, also linked in the description. Third, I've covered the life of Richard of Shrewsbury in another video, which discusses what we know about him before his time in the Tower and explores what I believe was planned for his future. That video is linked as well. It always feels a bit awkward to encourage viewers to watch all my videos outright, so I'll put it this way. If you're fascinated by this topic and enjoy my approach to history, you'll find plenty more related content in the description. But for now, let's get into the final chapter of this series. Warbeck is consistently described by historians as the greatest threat to Henry VII's reign. I share this view. However, the question arises, why was he considered so dangerous? Militarily, his challenge was far less serious than what we now call the Lambert-Simnel Rebellion. Henry VII never had to deploy a full army against him. Warbeck's first invasion attempt in 1495 was repelled by the local population of Kent. The Scots, who were supposedly fighting for him, were in reality only interested in a brief, plundering raid. And in 1497, Warbeck fled at the sight of Henry's advancing forces. Whenever battle was required, Warbeck failed. He was unable to take Waterford in Ireland. Exeter refused to surrender to him. In Kent in 1495, he didn't even set foot on shore. He was also repulsed by the brutality of his Scottish allies. The common people rarely rallied behind him, except for the rebels of 1497, who had already risen up and were decisively defeated. For them, Warbeck seemed to serve primarily as a figurehead, a convenient banner under which to mount another attempt against Henry. The true danger Warbeck posed lay in what he symbolized. The story of the princes in the Tower had already burned itself deep into the collective consciousness of the English people. Warbeck, claiming to be Richard of York, appeared to offer a miraculous resolution. A long-lost prince returned from the dead. In a deeply Christian society, he became a personification of resurrection itself. His supporters knew how to exploit this. Take, for example, this passage from a letter Margaret of Burgundy sent to Isabella of Castile. It is clear and certain that this man is the one whom they once thought dead. She did not call him a boy thought to be dead. And when addressing whether she had recognized him, Margaret wrote, "I recognized him not by one or two signs, but by so many particular signs that one man who has clues of this kind would scarcely be found among 10,000 individuals." This language echoes a well-known biblical passage. After 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst, and said, "Peace to you." Then he said to Thomas, "Reach your finger here, and look at my hands, and reach your hand here, and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing." Later, Warbeck also presented supposed birthmarks, distinguishing him as Richard of Shrewsbury, but his parallels with Christ didn't end there. Just as Jesus wandered from place to place and was recognized by many, Warbeck's own travels and the recognition he received, particularly in Ireland, were integral to his narrative. He leaned heavily into this divine mission in a letter to Isabella. "It pleased the divine clemency that Lord, having compassion on my innocence, preserved me alive and in safety. First, however, causing me to swear on the Holy Sacrament that to no one should I disclose my name, origin, or family until a certain number of years had passed." His proclamation as king, written in Scotland, followed the same pattern. He claimed to have escaped Henry's grasp by God's might. Henry, the first Tudor king, was described as our extreme and mortal enemy. Here, Warbeck employs a clever wordplay. While he speaks in the pluralis majestatis, the royal we, he also implies that Henry is the enemy of all the English people. Henry, Warbeck declared, had acted to the high displeasure of God, while he himself was God-fearing and destined to rule justly. If Henry remained in power, Warbeck warned, England faced certain destruction. The examples of Warbeck's portrayal as a Christ-like redeemer are numerous. But 2 points stand out. First, his religious messaging intensified only after arriving at Margaret of Burgundy's court, a sign, I believe, of the influence of the highly theologically educated Duchess. Second, invoking religion was essential. Warbeck was challenging a king anointed by God. Henry VII had done the same against Richard III, and his victory at Bosworth was seen as divine approval. Warbeck's supposed escape from the Tower was meant to demonstrate that God had chosen him for this mission. Margaret had learned from Lambert Simnel's failure. She understood that her niece, Elizabeth of York, was considered the leader of the House of York and had secured Henry's throne through their marriage. Simnel's claim to be Edward Plantagenet, son of George, Duke of Clarence, had been insufficient to challenge Elizabeth's standing. Warbeck, however, presented himself as the resurrected brother, an undeniable alternative. Margaret's ambitions are evident in a letter written in her name to the Pope. The original text is in Latin, and I translated it, first into my native German, then into English. It is advisable to verify my translation, but the key passage reads, "My Reverend Mistress and the Reverend Lord Richard, son of the brother of the late King, together with the whole illustrious family of the House of York, their successors, and all who were or will be attached to them, are right in this matter." Here, Margaret speaks not only for herself, but also for Warbeck and the entire House of York. Since Elizabeth opposed them, she was implicitly excluded from the House of York in Margaret's eyes. This aligns with another letter to Isabella, in which Warbeck is described as the sole survivor of our family, with no qualifier such as the only male survivor. Interestingly, the letter to the Pope is the only document in which Elizabeth is mentioned by name. The passage states, "However, in order to remove and forever abolish all the dissensions and enmities which had once prevailed between the distinguished houses of York and Lancaster, and to ensure lasting peace in that kingdom, he consented, at the express and special request of the three estates of the said kingdom, to take Princess Elizabeth, the firstborn daughter of King Edward and rightful heiress, as his wife." Notably, it is not Margaret who designates Elizabeth as the rightful heir. It is the three estates. The letter continues, and this despite the fact that the illustrious Lord Richard, the lawful son of the late King Edward and heir to the paternal kingdom, is still alive, and although according to the laws and customs of the kingdom, it is impossible for a daughter to inherit in any way so long as a son or the son of a brother exists. Margaret argues that Elizabeth's marriage and children were legitimized only by papal approval, which she claimed was fraudulently obtained. She wrote, "Aware of his illegitimate position, he, Henry VII, sought the support of the royal title of the House of York all the more. Therefore, he was appointed by His Holiness, the most venerable Pope Innocent VIII, not in his own right, but with concealment of the truth and under the pretext of false assertions." Margaret's attacks on Henry's legitimacy also extended to his ancestry. Nevertheless, a certain Henry, called Richmond of the House of Somerset, decided to break the law by pretending to be of the blood of the Lancasters, possibly with the intention of ruling, although he is aware that he was born of the adulterous unions of both parents. These accusations are ironic. Margaret publicly championed one of the princes in the Tower, even though her own brother Richard III had declared them illegitimate. Margaret even attempted to have Henry and Elizabeth's papal dispensation revoked, threatening the legitimacy of Elizabeth's children. This must have felt eerily familiar to Elizabeth, who, along with her children, was at one point taken to a fortress for safety, perhaps a calculated move by Henry to remind the public of the fate of the princes in the Tower. Ultimately, Warbeck's real danger wasn't his military prowess or his personal abilities. It was the idea of him, the hopes, desires, and longings he embodied. Unlike Simnel or the pitiful Edward Plantagenet, locked away in the Tower, Warbeck's story was compelling. People wanted it to be true, and in many ways, nothing has changed. History shifts our values, but some things remain constant. The murder of children is universally condemned. The fate of the princes in the Tower still haunts us. Warbeck, if real, offers an escape from that horror. But behind the myth, there was always someone guiding him on that path. The first historical trace of Warbeck dates back to September 1491, in the form of a letter from France promising support for the son of Clarence. Warbeck later indicated that this letter had been intended for him. In his correspondence with the Spanish monarchs, he wrote, "Thence being invited by the King of France, with many ships and attendants, and having been promised aid and assistance against Henry of Richmond, the wicked usurper of the Kingdom of England, I came to the aforesaid King of France, who received me honorably as a kinsman and friend." Unless we assume that the French crown simultaneously issued letters of support for both Warbeck and Edward Plantagenet, who was imprisoned in the Tower, it seems likely that Warbeck's original identity was that of Edward IV and Richard III's nephew. He indirectly confirmed this in his confession. While many dismiss his confession as unreliable due to the likelihood that it was made under duress, corroborating testimonies suggest that this particular detail was accurate. Warbeck himself claimed that he had not fabricated any of the identities attributed to him. Instead, others had imposed them upon him. Before being recognized as the younger of the princes in the Tower, He was reportedly identified as John de Pontefract, the illegitimate son of Richard III. There were also contemporary assertions, still taken seriously in some circles today, that he was an illegitimate son of Edward IV. As previously mentioned, Warbeck's recognition followed a biblical pattern. If he was indeed a pretender, his emergence from Flanders, a territory controlled by Margaret of Burgundy and Maximilian, suggests he was deliberately chosen. Margaret had learned from her failure with Lambert Simnel, and it was likely she who insisted that Warbeck embody one of the princes in the Tower. In her statements, she consistently omitted any prior identity and referred to him solely as Richard. This distinction was particularly important to her. While Simnel had been guided by figures like Sir Francis Lovell and John de la Pole, Margaret took personal charge of Warbeck's cause. The inevitable question arises: did Margaret believe Warbeck was genuine? If we begin with Warbeck's own account, the answer is no. In his confession, he explicitly stated that Margaret had known his true identity from the outset. However, this was also the answer Henry VII wanted, so we should not take it at face value. In her biography of Elizabeth of York, Amy Lysons suggests that Warbeck may have been Margaret's illegitimate son. If that were the case, she would of course have known his real identity. Notably, in her letter to Isabella of Castile, Margaret described receiving Warbeck as a grandson or a son. I have already discussed the possibility that he was, in fact, an illegitimate son of Edward IV. There are two key arguments against this, aside from Margaret's own insistence that Warbeck was the real Richard of Shrewsbury. First, when she learned of his capture in 1497, she expressed deep emotion. He was not just anyone to her, she showed him genuine affection. Second, she had his lodgings in her palace marked with the name Richard, reinforcing the idea that she was committed to presenting him as the younger prince in the Tower. In the past, some have speculated that Margaret merely wanted Warbeck to be Richard. This theory is partly based on Wim Blockman's excellent work on her character. Margaret saw her marriage to Charles the Bold as a failure, having been unable to bear children. She then endured the collapse of her family's power in England. She was a woman searching for purpose, and perhaps for redemption. Her ambitions are evident in the way she referred to herself. In a letter to the Pope, she signed as Margaret of England, subtly asserting a claim to the throne she had never truly relinquished. This was not standard practice, as proven by her crown, which she wore on multiple occasions in Burgundy. It is now housed in Aachen, inscribed not with England, but with York. I am convinced that Margaret did not believe Warbeck was Richard, nor did she want him to be. My reasoning is based on this passage from her letter to the Pope. Even if the York family's scepter were to be revoked, which must not happen, there are individuals in the Lancaster family who are far superior to Henry in hereditary claims and who come from a legitimately recognized line of descent, not from a condemnable union. Margaret's primary goal was to overthrow Henry VII. To that end, she was willing to consider alternative candidates beyond Warbeck. That her step-grandson, Philip of Burgundy, was among the Lancastrian claimants certainly worked in her favor. I do not believe she wanted Warbeck to be Richard because Richard was also half Woodville. Margaret had never shown interest in the fate of the princes in the Tower. In fact, she had actively supported Richard III's efforts to capture Henry Tudor and his followers on the continent. Her indifference to the missing princes is apparent in every document she and Warbeck produced regarding his supposed escape. Warbeck claimed that he was almost 9 years old when he was rescued from the Tower. This would place his escape in 1482, during Edward IV's reign. More likely, he meant almost 10 years old. If this were true, Richard III would have been responsible not only for Edward V's murder, but also for Warbeck's fate as a fugitive, robbed of his family, status, and fortune. And yet, Richard III is either conspicuously absent from Warbeck's narrative or mentioned only in passing. In the past, this omission was explained as a strategic move. Warbeck's supporters needed to focus on deposing Henry VII, not attacking Richard III. After all, Henry had little reason to denounce Richard when his primary concern was proving Warbeck a fraud. Still, Richard's absence is striking. Warbeck's supposed identity as Richard of Shrewsbury only begins with his transfer to the Tower from Sanctuary, without any discussion of why Sanctuary had been necessary. The most plausible explanation is that this omission was deliberate. Margaret was unwilling to critically examine her brother's actions, as doing so would have cast a favourable light on the Woodvilles, her longtime rivals. She liked Perkin Warbeck as a person and was willing to play a public role in presenting him as Richard of Shrewsbury, but her commitment had its limits. A telling example is a letter she wrote to Henry VII after Warbeck's failed escape. We know of this letter from a report by the Spanish ambassador Rodrigo González de la Puebla, dated September 7, 1498. Margaret pledged obedience to Henry and begged for his pardon. The Spanish suspected she wrote this letter because Henry had negotiated a treaty with Archduke Philip that contained a clause directly targeting the Dowager Duchess. The Tudor king had lost patience with her schemes and pressured Philip to act against her. Philip, who was fond of Margaret, found himself in a difficult position. Confronted with a choice between her step-grandson and Warbeck, Margaret ultimately chose Philip. Even if it meant recognizing Tudor rule, she abandoned her supposed nephew. Likely it was a painful decision, but she made it nonetheless. This brings us to how Margaret of Burgundy used Warbeck strategically. Her goal was clear: to neutralize Elizabeth of York as a factor in the power struggle. The Queen was immensely popular among the people, largely due to her personal suffering and the many losses she had endured. However, Warbeck, posing as Richard of Shrewsbury, had an even more dramatic story. As the supposed son of Edward IV, he had a direct claim to the throne and the right to rule in his own name. Margaret and Warbeck did not initially target the general populace. Instead, they focused on Yorkist loyalists within Henry VII's royal court, the very people who had played a crucial role in securing Henry's victory at the Battle of Bosworth out of loyalty to Elizabeth. Margaret and Warbeck sought to persuade these men to switch sides. Ideally, this would leave Henry unable to trust his closest allies. In a perfect scenario for Margaret and Warbeck, this would have led to Henry's immediate downfall. At the very least, it would have fostered suspicion and discord, weakening his hold on power. From later events, we know exactly whom Margaret and Warbeck aimed to recruit. Notably, none of these individuals had connections to the Woodville family. Their strategy was to appeal exclusively to former supporters of Edward IV, Edward V, and Richard III, who had no ties to Elizabeth's maternal relatives. This was the sharpest possible attack on Elizabeth from a distance. The loyalty of these men had secured her position. Without them, she and her family would be entirely dependent on the Tudors and their allies for protection. Margaret and Warbeck's view on this matter was unmistakable. Henry would abandon Elizabeth if necessary. Those who do not see Margaret as an enemy of Elizabeth often argue that this strategy was intended to alienate Elizabeth from her husband, forcing her to defect. This theory is also the basis for speculation, though it remains just that Elizabeth's paternal grandmother, Cecily Neville, supported Warbeck. Proponents of this idea frequently cite a passage from Margaret's letter to the Pope, which states that Henry and his heirs would still be allowed to reign, even after Elizabeth's death. This message was meant to underscore the precariousness of Elizabeth's position. However, such reasoning fails to recognize that she once again faced the threat of losing everything she held dear, this time, even her children. For Elizabeth, the real danger did not come from the Tudors, but from Margaret and Warbeck. This, too, was a calculated move. If Elizabeth remained loyal to Henry, she would be seen as the woman who turned against her resurrected brother, the rightful king. Given his supposed legitimacy, such a betrayal would severely damage her reputation and popularity. It was a carefully set trap, one that put Elizabeth in an impossible position. Henry, for his part, knew that he could not disown his wife. She was the very reason he had ascended to power, and her lineage was crucial to securing the legitimacy of their heirs. Historian Nathan Amian suggests that Henry never remarried after Elizabeth's death to avoid jeopardizing this legitimacy. While this argument could be debated, especially considering Henry's serious contemplation of marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the fundamental point remains. He understood Elizabeth's importance. Escaping the trap set by Margaret and Warbeck required restoring Elizabeth's position as the symbolic leader of the House of York. As I discussed in the previous episode, she was reinstated by reclaiming all her family's lands. Holding the legal status of a female sole like Margaret Beaufort, she had the authority to manage these estates herself, which to some extent she did. While she delegated some responsibilities to Henry and granted land to Arthur and her other children, she remained actively involved. The primary reason she was not always visible in this role was her frequent pregnancies throughout the 1490s. The most significant symbolic act was the appointment of their second-born son, Henry, as Duke of York, Elizabeth's own duchy. By willingly relinquishing this title, she sent a clear message of support. She attended all the ceremonies and was dressed in royal colors throughout. This was a masterstroke. Everyone who participated in the celebrations implicitly endorsed the legitimacy of the investiture. Henry orchestrated a grand spectacle around his wife and son, carefully presenting an image of unity and noble loyalty across the kingdom. That this message was successfully conveyed is evident in Margaret and Warbeck's repeated vocal objections to the creation of a Duke of York when, according to them, one already existed. This is often misinterpreted as mere mockery of the Tudors. However, the widespread public support surrounding the event posed a real problem for Warbeck's cause. Anyone who aligned with him now understood that they were positioning themselves against the many nobles and dignitaries who had endorsed the new Duke of York. This had a strong deterrent effect, especially on those who valued stability and had no desire to see England return to civil war. Henry had already invested heavily in this vision long before Warbeck's emergence. The Tudor rose remains the enduring emblem of these efforts. As his wife and the mother of his heirs, Elizabeth was not only meant to secure the loyalty of the House of York, but to embody the very end of the civil wars. Warbeck symbolized conflict. Elizabeth represented peace and unity. This was the new narrative the Tudors crafted to counter the myth of Richard's resurrection. Elizabeth's role in the fight against Warbeck was not limited to being a symbolic figure. She also took practical action. A common question is why she did not openly denounce Warbeck. However, this perspective overlooks her position. She was raised to be an obedient wife and a devoted mother, and her role did not involve making public political statements. This was the traditional gender expectation for a queen. Modern interpretations often misjudge this because women like Margaret Beaufort, Margaret of Anjou, and, to a lesser extent, Elizabeth Woodville acted outside these norms. However, both Margaret of Anjou and Elizabeth Woodville only did so when their husbands were either dead or incapable of acting publicly. The only exception was Margaret Beaufort, who consistently defied the expectations placed upon her as a woman. This contrast has shaped the perception that Margaret Beaufort wielded political power, while Elizabeth was merely a passive Tudor birthing machine. Yet there is little evidence to support this view. A frequently cited letter from the Spanish ambassador to his rulers states, "The Queen is a very noble woman and much beloved. She is kept in subjection by the mother of the king. It would be a good thing to write often to her and to show her a little love." However, what is often overlooked is that this letter is dated mid-July 1498, right when Elizabeth's new pregnancy had been discovered. Margaret Beaufort had established protocols dictating the behavior of pregnant queens at this time, which likely explains the ambassador's comment. Since this is the only known statement of its kind, it should be understood in that specific context. In contrast, the same ambassador reported in 1488 that he met Elizabeth alone without Henry present. "We also went at an unexpected hour to the Queen, whom we found with 32 companions of angelical appearance, and all we saw there seemed very magnificent and in splendid style, as was suitable for the occasion." Furthermore, Ferdinand of Aragon wrote directly to Elizabeth, not Henry, a year later to inform her of a great victory against Islam that all Christians should know about. Elizabeth also corresponded personally with Isabella and Ferdinand multiple times regarding Arthur and Catherine's marriage. On December 3, 1497, she wrote to the Spanish Queen, requesting more frequent letters. Notably, she wrote, "We should have written you the news of our state, and of that of this kingdom. But the most serene Lord the King, our husband, will have written at length of these things to your majesties." This clearly indicates that Elizabeth was aware of Henry's correspondence, and the couple consulted each other on political matters. She also attended lengthy meetings focused on marriage negotiations. When the issue arose of financing the Spanish ambassador's living expenses in England, Elizabeth and Henry initially offered him ecclesiastical benefices. After he rejected this offer, it was Elizabeth who persuaded him to accept an arranged marriage that would provide for him, securing his loyalty to both her and Henry. Elizabeth was also known to have letters rewritten multiple times when dissatisfied with their content, particularly in foreign affairs, where her ancestry played a crucial role. The most famous example of this was her involvement in arranging her son's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. She frequently collaborated with Margaret Beaufort in these matters. When it came to Margaret Tudor's marriage to the King of Scotland, Henry himself complained that both his mother and wife were making life difficult for him. These examples, and many more, demonstrate that Elizabeth played an active political role, contributing where she was most effective. This was true for Margaret Beaufort as well. Elizabeth's visibility fluctuated primarily due to her pregnancies and the constraints of her upbringing, rather than a lack of influence. Against Warbeck, however, she was far more visibly engaged. When Henry toured the kingdom in 1494 to convince the people that Warbeck was not Richard, Elizabeth accompanied him, reinforcing his authority. Additionally, several strategic actions could only have taken place with her consultation and approval. In 1493, an embassy led by William Warham visited Margaret of Burgundy and Warbeck. During this visit, Warham, the future Archbishop of Canterbury, made a striking public claim. Henry VII had evidence that Richard of Shrewsbury was dead. Naturally, no one present believed this statement, as acknowledging it would have required them to abandon Warbeck immediately. But that was not the point. This marked the first time the Tudors had publicly addressed the fate of the princes in the Tower. The message needed to spread, and Elizabeth, as Richard's sister, could have been questioned about its truthfulness. This suggests she was aware of the plan and had consented to the claim being made. 2 years later, in 1495, another diplomatic mission made this strategy even clearer. Henry sent envoys to Burgundy to negotiate a trade treaty and persuade Duke Philip's Privy Council to cease supporting Warbeck. The treaty was finalized a year later when Philip came of age. The Privy Council informed the English delegation that while they would no longer back Warbeck, they could not interfere with Margaret of Burgundy's personal finances or actions. She was present at the meeting, along with Warbeck, and was already seething with anger. The English delegation was led by Sir Charles Somerset, a trusted confidant of Henry VII, who had family ties to the Woodvilles through the Herbert line. Somerset had also attended Elizabeth Woodville's funeral in 1492. During the meeting, he greeted everyone appropriately, except Warbeck, whom he pointedly ignored. Outraged, Margaret demanded an explanation. Somerset responded, "I do not welcome fraudsters, but I would be happy to show Margaret the chapel in England where the real Richard of Shrewsbury is buried." Warbeck exploded with rage, vowing that Somerset would regret his words once he became King of England. Once again, the key objective was to control the narrative. And once again, it is implausible that Elizabeth was unaware of or uninvolved in this effort. She would have needed to approve such a bold move. This naturally raises two key questions. Was the claim true? And if so, what was the proof? Or where was this chapel? Unfortunately, I cannot provide definitive answers. Personally, I doubt the claim's authenticity. The goal was not to reveal the truth, but to publicly undermine Warbeck. Given Elizabeth's own suffering over her brother's fate, she likely resented having it used against her. Her heightened involvement in Arthur's wedding preparations should also be understood in this context. Margaret of Burgundy and Warbeck recognized that this marriage would bolster the Tudor dynasty's legitimacy across Europe. The Spanish rulers themselves had a claim to the English throne through the Lancastrian line, and by marrying their daughter to Henry's heir, they were implicitly endorsing his reign. Margaret and Warbeck thus attempted to sway Isabella and Ferdinand early on. Elizabeth, in turn, understood the importance of Spain's support. So much so that on one occasion she refused to part with a particularly favorable letter from Spain, even though Henry wanted to carry it with him. I titled this video "Silent Screams" to illustrate Elizabeth's strategy. Her role in the Warbeck conflict was not to publicly denounce him. Speaking out directly would only have drawn more attention, as it was highly unusual for a queen to make political statements. The only exception to this was if she publicly and effectively pleaded with Henry for pardons. To counter Warbeck, Elizabeth had to maintain protocol. She could not break the expectations placed upon her, but she could take actions that made her position unmistakably clear. Her influence was silent but powerful. It is well known that Henry used spies to undermine both Warbeck and Margaret. The most famous of these was Robert Clifford, who was handsomely rewarded for his services. Those who facilitated his return to England also received compensation for their efforts. Clifford had been documented near the royal court as early as the reign of Edward IV, making it possible that Elizabeth was familiar with him. However, that is not the main point here. More importantly, Clifford provided damning evidence that Warbeck's supporters had infiltrated the royal court itself. This revelation triggered a brutal purge. Henry responded by establishing commissions to investigate Warbeck sympathizers across England, all of which were led by staunch Lancastrian loyalists. Among the victims of these purges were men who had once been loyal to Elizabeth. This raises significant questions. Did she know about the planned purges? Did she approve of these measures? Judging by the fact that Elizabeth became pregnant again in the latter half of 1495, Her marriage to Henry does not appear to have suffered as a result. Moreover, Henry did not hesitate to target even those connected to him by blood. Stanley, who had placed the crown on Henry's head at Bosworth and was the brother of his stepfather, was not spared. However, Woodville Yorkists were notably absent from the list of purge victims. Henry made it clear that individuals demonstrably loyal to the Queen had nothing to fear, a promise that was upheld. This suggests a compelling possibility. Elizabeth and Henry's fates were deeply intertwined at this time, and she was aware of and in agreement with the actions being taken. Furthermore, strong evidence suggests that Clifford had been working as Henry's spy from the very beginning, rather than defecting. He was among the first recipients of a royal letter when a military conflict erupted with rebels in 1497, an honour reserved only for those the king trusted completely. It remains uncertain whether Warbeck and Margaret knew of Clifford's true allegiance. However, by the time of the 1495 purges, their cause had already suffered a devastating blow. Their support within the nobility had been shattered. Warbeck later attempted to counter this by arguing that Henry surrounded himself primarily with men of low birth, with few exceptions. But this tactic failed. Ultimately, the idea that Henry's rule would bring stability and an end to civil war was far more appealing to the common people than Warbeck's narrative of miraculous survival, especially as cracks in his story began to show. This was the primary reason his first invasion attempt ended in disaster. By 1495, Warbeck and Margaret had been effectively reduced to seeking support from foreign rulers. However, their options were quickly dwindling. That same year, Spain declared that it had never believed in Warbeck's claim. At the time, Spain was focused on persuading Henry to join the Holy League, and the Iberians exerted considerable pressure on Maximilian to withdraw his backing for Warbeck. Although Maximilian officially refused, he quietly stopped providing financial support. Margaret lost even more influence over Burgundy through the double marriage of her step-grandchildren, Philip and Margaret, to the Spanish royal family. Meanwhile, Henry repeatedly wrote to Princess Margaret, expressing his desire to welcome her to England and promising to receive her like a daughter. France had also ceased to be an ally to Warbeck, as King Charles was more concerned with preventing Henry from joining the Holy League. This left only Scotland. The young King James IV was eager for war with England, and Warbeck provided a convenient justification. Whether James truly believed in Warbeck's identity, genuinely supported the idea of restoring a Yorkist king, or simply assumed that the English people would rally behind them once the Scottish army crossed the border, remains uncertain. James treated Warbeck like a king, but carefully avoided crossing certain lines. He gave him Catherine Gordon, a distant relative, as a wife. However, their blood ties were distant enough that James could claim the marriage was merely a gesture of hospitality rather than proof that he fully accepted Warbeck's claim. The military actions that followed were nothing more than brief, plundering raids, and the English population did not rise in support of Warbeck. Politically, James lost interest in him at that point. Though he continued to treat Warbeck with kindness, he withdrew all serious backing. This may have been due, in part, to Warbeck himself. He reportedly expressed fear and discomfort over the violence, showing none of the qualities expected of a warrior king. Henry had also outmaneuvered Warbeck by proposing a marriage between his eldest daughter, Margaret, and James IV. James needed the financial advantages that such a marriage would bring, but in accepting the match, he was also implicitly recognizing Henry's legitimacy. It was a price he was willing to pay. Henry, determined to secure the union, pushed the marriage through despite opposition from both his wife and mother. He only agreed to send Margaret to Scotland a few years later. He even admitted to the Spanish ambassador that he knew his daughter was still too tender for marriage, but had no political choice. The greatest advantage Warbeck gained from his time in Scotland was his wife, Catherine Gordon. She remained by his side when he made his final attempt at securing the throne, this time leading a rebellion in Cornwall. The outcome is well known. He was defeated and captured by Henry. His wife soon surrendered to the Tudor king as well. Henry treated Catherine with kindness, though Elizabeth's biographer, Amy Licence, speculates that the Queen may have worried he was too kind. However, I have found no evidence to suggest an affair between Henry and Catherine, so I will leave that as speculation. Catherine went on to become one of Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting and likely a close friend. She even played a ceremonial role at Elizabeth's funeral. As part of his strategy, Henry forced Warbeck to confess to Catherine that he was not Richard of Shrewsbury. Whether the king truly expected her to believe this remains doubtful. Regardless, Henry took further precautions, prohibiting the couple from sharing a bed. Officially, this was justified on the grounds that their marriage had been based on a lie and was therefore invalid. In reality, neither Henry nor Elizabeth wanted Catherine to become pregnant. Fictional accounts sometimes suggest that Catherine bore Warbeck a child, but there is no historical evidence to support this claim. Elizabeth's role in this situation was once again evident. By keeping Catherine in her household, she was able to ensure that no pregnancy occurred. As long as Warbeck was alive, and for the first 9 months after his execution, any child she bore would have been assumed to be his. To prevent such a possibility, Catherine needed to be monitored in a way that preserved her dignity. Elizabeth's household was the perfect solution. In later years, Catherine remarried several times. Yet in her will, she named all her husbands except for Warbeck. This omission may have been because their marriage was never truly recognized, or perhaps she simply wished to forget that chapter of her life. But what about the supposed siblings? Did Elizabeth and Warbeck ever meet? Anyone familiar with the subject knows that no recorded meeting exists. At least, no surviving source confirms such an encounter. However, there were 2 occasions when it was highly likely that Elizabeth and her alleged brother were in the same place at the same time. Both were present at the palaces of Richmond and Greenwich simultaneously. While this does not necessarily mean they met, it makes the possibility quite plausible. It is likely that no staged confrontation between them was ever intended. Had Henry used his wife to publicly deny Warbeck's claim that he was the younger prince from the Tower, he would have only reignited the controversy. Observers would have endlessly debated how convincing Elizabeth's denial was, which in turn could have fueled doubts about Warbeck's confession. In essence, such a spectacle would have implied that Henry himself was unsure whether his subjects truly believed Warbeck's admission. Politically, it was far wiser not to orchestrate a meeting between Elizabeth and Warbeck. If Henry had lacked trust in his wife, he could have used one of her sisters instead. Yet, as far as we know, none of Elizabeth's sisters ever expressed a desire to see Warbeck. It is worth considering that none of the sisters may have wanted to meet a man they likely viewed as someone who had stolen the identity of their deceased brother. The fact that centuries later some would interpret this absence of contact as proof that Henry feared someone might recognize Warbeck was almost certainly irrelevant to the decisions made at the time regarding the prisoner and his supposed relatives. Returning to Elizabeth's aunt. In principle, Margaret of Burgundy no longer played a political role after 1496. As I have already mentioned, she officially capitulated after Warbeck's capture in a letter. Amiens wonders if she could have been involved in Warbeck's escape attempt with Edward Plantagenet from the Tower in 1499. but there is no evidence to support this, and it was likely not the case. In the years that followed, Margaret was approached by Edmund and Richard de la Pole. She offered them temporary shelter and provisions before recommending them to Maximilian. However, this was nothing compared to the commitment she had shown in support of Simnel and Warbeck. This brings me to my speculation regarding what her ultimate goal for England might have been if she had succeeded. It is pure conjecture, but I believe she wanted to free George's son, Edward Plantagenet, and see him on the throne. This is likely why Simnel assumed his identity and why Margaret eventually gave up after Warbeck's failure. Her submission to Henry could have been an attempt to save her nephew's life. She must have known that the Spaniards were exerting significant pressure on Henry, and that for Catherine of Aragon to marry into England, both Warbeck and Edward would have to die. By the end of her life, Margaret had been thoroughly beaten when it came to England. However, she succeeded in preserving her name in Burgundy, which was perhaps the last victory she could claim. This brings us to the conclusion of this video and series. Elizabeth gave birth to their third son, Edmund, in March 1499. The pregnancy was considered high risk, and there were serious concerns for her life. By the end of the year, the Tudor world seemed to have stabilized. Warbeck and Edward Plantagenet were dead. Margaret of Burgundy had surrendered, and Henry and Elizabeth had 3 sons. The ideal bride had been secured for the crown prince. It appeared that the turbulence of the Wars of the Roses had finally been resolved. The couple looked forward to the prospect of ruling in peace and security. However, this period of tranquility would prove to be fleeting. A series of devastating misfortunes followed in quick succession. Henry and Elizabeth had fought for over 15 years, even longer if you consider the challenges Henry faced under Edward IV and Richard III. Elizabeth had lost her family in 1483 and was determined never to face such a loss again. Both the king and queen were exhausted, and what came next would break them. Henry fell gravely ill after Elizabeth's death. Rumors swirled about who would become king if he were to die. His last surviving son was considered too young to rule, and it seemed as though history was repeating itself. Henry clung to life as long as possible, hoping to see his son mature enough to be accepted as the rightful ruler. These years spent beside his bitter, fearful, depressed, and sick father would deeply shape the future king, fueling his legendary paranoia and his obsession with securing male heirs. Elizabeth had triumphed over Margaret, but the cost had been high. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.